Hello, my dear friends. Welcome to Hauntra. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon so that you don't miss any exciting coming up videos. It was the dead of night, the kind of eerie quiet that seemed to swallow the world whole. Jake was on a solo road trip, traveling through a desolate stretch of highway that cut through the heart of nowhere. He had been driving for hours, the only light coming from the headlights of his car and the faint glow of stars above. The air was cool, and the road was empty. He'd passed through small towns earlier in the day, but now he was in the middle of nowhere. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, bordered by dense woods on either side. He'd already driven past a few abandoned gas stations and eerie, empty turnoffs. The only sounds in the car were the hum of the engine and the soft click of the turn signal as he made another sharp left. His phone had no signal, and he had long since run out of his audiobook to entertain him. The loneliness of the road started to get to him, the isolation sinking deeper with each passing mile. He checked the time, 3:12 a.m. He figured he'd pull over at the next rest stop and stretch his legs, maybe grab a coffee to fight the fatigue. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something ahead. A figure standing on the side of the road. Jake slowed down, unsure if it was a mirage caused by his tiredness. It was a man, dressed in a tattered coat, standing motionless by the edge of the highway. There was no other car in sight, and the man seemed out of place in the wilderness. Jake's heart raced. He'd heard about the dangers of picking up hitchhikers, but he wasn't in a position to help. What if the man was stranded, or worse, hurt? He hesitated, but eventually decided that he couldn't just leave him there in the cold. His heart thudded in his chest as he pulled over and rolled down the passenger side window. "Need a ride?" Jake called out, his voice hesitant. The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his face hidden beneath the brim of a worn-out hat. Jake's nerves were on edge, but his empathy pushed him to offer help. The man took a step forward and, without saying a word, opened the passenger side door. "Get in," Jake urged, trying to mask the unease in his voice. The man didn't speak as he slid into the seat, his eyes never meeting Jake's. There was something off about him. His clothes were far too old for the weather, and his hands were shaking. His breath was heavy, almost like he had been running, though there were no signs of him being in any hurry. As soon as the man settled in, Jake continued driving. The silence between them was palpable. He tried to make conversation, but the man only responded with short, non-committal grunts. Jake asked about the man's destination, but he received no answer. A cold chill seemed to fill the car, despite the warm air conditioning. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man's eyes remained fixed on the floor, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Minutes passed, and the road stretched ahead, empty as ever. Then, out of nowhere, the man spoke. "Stop the car," he said in a raspy voice, his words cutting through the stillness like a knife. Jake looked over at him, startled. "What?" "I said, stop the car," the man repeated, his voice more insistent this time. Confused and feeling increasingly uncomfortable, Jake obeyed, pulling the car over to the side of the road. The man immediately opened the door and stepped out without a single glance back. He didn't even thank Jake for the ride. Jake watched in bewilderment as the man walked into the darkness, disappearing into the dense woods. For a moment, Jake sat there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The entire encounter felt wrong, like it had never truly happened. His mind was racing with questions. Who was the man? Why did he suddenly leave? And why had he looked so strange? Still shaken, Jake started the car and resumed his journey. He had hoped that getting back on the road would help him shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him. But as he drove, his thoughts kept circling back to the hitchhiker. There was no explanation for the oddness of the encounter, and that unsettled him more than anything. As Jake approached the next town, he began to see faint lights in the distance. Relief washed over him. He would finally be able to stop and get some rest. But when he passed a small sign that read, "Welcome to Milford," something caught his eye. It was the same sign that had greeted him when he entered the highway hours ago. Confusion gripped him as he glanced at the GPS. It showed he was still hours away from any real town, but he could have sworn he had just passed a sign welcoming him to Milford. He quickly glanced at the rearview mirror, his breath catching in his throat. The figure of the man was standing at the side of the road again, right where he had picked him up. But this time, the man was facing him. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, and his mouth hung slightly open in what looked like a grim smile. The air in the car grew heavy, thick with an unsettling presence. Jake's heart began to pound in his chest as he quickly swerved to the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. He looked back in the mirror, but there was no one there. No sign of the man, no trace of anything, just the empty stretch of highway. For a few moments, Jake sat there in stunned silence, trying to make sense of the strange events. He didn't know what was real anymore. The hitchhiker, the woods, the sign, it all felt like some sick dream, a twisted nightmare that he couldn't escape. But then, as if pulled by some invisible force, he heard a faint tapping on the back window. Slowly, his eyes shifted toward the rearview mirror again, and his stomach dropped. There, staring back at him with hollow eyes, was the man. His face was now pressed against the glass, his breath fogging up the window in a grotesque manner. His hands were pressed flat against the car, his nails scratching at the surface. Jake screamed, his mind racing, and without thinking, he slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The car roared to life, the engine screaming in protest as he sped down the road, faster and faster. The man didn't move, didn't budge, but as Jake glanced at the rearview mirror, he could see the figure now trailing behind, running at an impossible speed, keeping pace with the car. No matter how fast Jake drove, the man was always there, just out of reach but never far enough. Panic overtook him, and with his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, he forced himself to look ahead. The road stretched out endlessly, the miles and miles of isolation mocking him. The man, though, kept running, his face more contorted and desperate with every passing second. Eventually, Jake couldn't take it anymore. His vision blurred with terror, and his hands were slick with sweat. His pulse thumped in his ears, drowning out the sound of the engine and the wild beating of his heart. He floored the car, desperate to escape, but nothing worked. The man was always there, a relentless phantom. When the sun finally began to rise, the figure was gone. The road was empty, silent once more. But Jake knew better than to trust his senses. The hitchhiker was still out there, waiting, and he would never forget the face that had been pressed against his car window, as though it had been staring into his soul. It was supposed to be a quick detour, a shortcut that would shave hours off his trip. Nathan had been driving for what felt like days, the tires humming steadily on the highway as he tried to keep his focus. He was on his way to a business meeting in a small, sleepy town a few states over. The GPS had suggested a new route that promised to be faster, an old, winding road through the mountains. He had never taken this route before, but the thought of reaching his destination earlier was too tempting to pass up. The sun was beginning to set as he veered off the main highway, the road ahead becoming more narrow and uneven. The GPS gave a soft chime, confirming that he was on the right path. The trees on either side of the road thickened, casting long, dark shadows across the asphalt. Nathan felt a slight unease, but he shrugged it off. It was just the unfamiliarity of the route, nothing more. As he drove deeper into the mountains, the road twisted and turned, the landscape becoming more isolated. The occasional rustle of leaves and the sound of his tires rolling over gravel were the only things breaking the silence. The further Nathan went, the more the setting felt like something out of a forgotten world, a place untouched by time. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the headlights of his car seemed to do little to push back the encroaching darkness. Nathan reached for his phone, but the signal had already dropped. Great, he thought. Now I'm really on my own. He glanced nervously at the dark stretch of road ahead. The only thing visible in his rearview mirror was the empty, twisting road behind him. Just as he was starting to regret his decision, he saw it. Up ahead, there was a small, dilapidated gas station with a flickering neon light. The sign read, "Cold Springs Gas and Supplies." It seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere, but Nathan was relieved. He hadn't passed another station in miles, and his fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. Pulling in, he parked the car under the dim light, noticing how quiet the place was. Too quiet. A lone figure stood behind the counter, an older man with graying hair and a weary look on his face. He didn't seem particularly surprised to see Nathan. "Need gas?" the man asked, his voice rough and tired. Nathan nodded, stepping out of the car. "Yeah, and maybe some directions. I'm trying to get to Willow Creek, but this road's a bit strange." The man gave a slow nod, eyeing Nathan carefully. "Willow Creek, huh? You sure you want to go there?" Nathan frowned, a chill running down his spine. "What do you mean?" The old man's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to the road behind Nathan. "A lot of folks don't come back from Willow Creek. You might want to think twice about that detour." Nathan chuckled nervously, but the unease was starting to creep up again. "I'll be fine. Just need to top off the tank and get going." The old man didn't say anything more, but his eyes remained fixed on Nathan as he pumped gas. When he finished, Nathan paid the man, who handed him a weathered map. "You'll want to take the right fork after the next bend. Be careful, though. That road's full of surprises." Nathan didn't know what to make of the cryptic warning, but he shrugged it off. Maybe the old man was just trying to spook him. After all, it was an isolated gas station in the middle of nowhere. As he drove away, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, the trees seemed to close in more tightly, and the road grew narrower with every mile. He reached the fork the man had mentioned, and without thinking, he took the right turn. The road ahead was even worse than before. Uneven and barely wide enough for his car, it wound around sharp corners, and the trees on either side seemed to crowd in, blocking out most of the moonlight. The quiet was oppressive, the kind that made you feel like something was lurking just out of sight. The night felt thicker here, colder, as if the very air was watching him. After what felt like an eternity of driving, Nathan saw a light in the distance. It flickered like a distant campfire, and for a brief moment he thought he might be approaching another town or maybe a lodge. But as he drew closer, the light revealed itself to be something far more unsettling. A small, abandoned cabin on the side of the road, its windows dark and empty. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. He was sure he hadn't seen this on the map, and there was no sign of life anywhere nearby. A shiver ran down his spine, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something about the cabin felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He considered turning around, but then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Just as he was about to pass the cabin, he saw a figure standing in the window. A woman, her pale face staring out at him. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no emotion in them. No movement. Just a cold, lifeless stare. Nathan's pulse quickened. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, speeding past the cabin. The image of the woman's face haunted him, her eyes following him as if they were carved into his memory. But as he glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, his stomach dropped. The woman was no longer in the window. Instead, there was a shadow standing by the front door, watching him as he drove away. He didn't know what to make of it, but he didn't care. He just needed to get off this road. He pressed the pedal to the floor, desperate to escape the creeping dread that had settled over him. But the road ahead was different. The trees had parted, revealing a vast, empty expanse. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging. No signs of life, no towns, no other cars, just the eerie stillness. The GPS had gone silent, and there was no way to know where he was. And then in the distance, Nathan saw something else. A figure standing in the middle of the road. The headlights illuminated the shape, and his heart stopped in his chest. It was the same woman from the cabin, standing motionless in the middle of the road. Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking, her face expressionless. Nathan slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car swerved violently, the tires screeching as they skidded off the road and into the dense woods. Everything went black. Derek, Maya, and a convoy of 3 other vehicles were traveling together for their annual off-road adventure. It was a tradition among friends, a chance to escape the mundane grind and embrace the thrill of driving through rugged terrains. This year, their destination was an old, forgotten trail known as Black Ridge Pass, a route steeped in local legends and tales of disappearances. Derek, the unofficial leader of the group, had brushed off the warnings. "It's just folklore," he said confidently as the convoy started the trek. The 5 vehicles were loaded with supplies, radios were synced, and everyone was in high spirits. As they reached the start of Black Ridge Pass, the dense forest on either side seemed to swallow the sunlight. The road was unpaved, marked by deep ruts and loose gravel. Derek's SUV led the way, followed by Maya and her cousin Liam in the second vehicle. The others followed close behind, their headlights forming a comforting line of light in the growing dusk. "Everyone doing okay?" Derek's voice crackled through the radio. "We're good," Maya responded, her voice tinged with excitement. The convoy pressed on, the path narrowing and the trees thickening with every mile. The towering pines seemed almost alive, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping unnaturally fast. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the convoy was enveloped in darkness. The only light came from their headlights, which barely pierced the dense fog rolling in. Maya glanced at the dashboard clock. It was just past 7 p.m., but it felt much later. "Let's pick up the pace." Derek's voice came through the radio again. "This fog is getting worse." The convoy sped up slightly, but the road's uneven terrain made it difficult to maintain control. Maya's car hit a pothole, jarring her and Liam in their seats. "Watch it," Liam said, clutching the dashboard. Suddenly, Derek's taillights disappeared ahead of them. Maya frowned, gripping the radio. "Derek? You okay up there?" "Static." "Derek?" she repeated, her voice rising with worry. Static again. The second vehicle pulled closer to where Derek's SUV had been, but the road ahead was empty. No taillights, no sign of his car, nothing. "He was right here," Maya said, panic creeping into her voice. Liam looked out the window, his face pale. "There's no way he could have gone off-road here. The trees are too close together." The other vehicles in the convoy stopped behind Maya's. The drivers got out, confusion etched on their faces. "Where's Derek?" one of them asked. "I don't know," Maya replied, her eyes scanning the fog-shrouded path. "He just vanished." The group decided to move together, with Maya now leading. The convoy crept forward, their headlights cutting through the oppressive fog. The silence was as deafening, broken only by the crunch of gravel under their tires. Minutes later, the second vehicle in line disappeared. One moment, its headlights were visible in Maya's rearview mirror. The next, they were gone. "Did you see that?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. Maya slammed on the brakes, grabbing the radio. "Vehicle 2, respond." Nothing but static. The remaining drivers were now on high alert, their previous confidence replaced with unease. The group huddled in the headlights of Maya's car, debating what to do next. "We can't just stay here," one of them said. "Whatever's happening, we need to keep moving." Reluctantly, they agreed and resumed their journey. Maya drove slowly, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Liam kept glancing out the windows, his paranoia growing with every passing second. The convoy thinned further as another vehicle vanished, this time without a sound. One moment it was there, and the next, the road behind them was empty. Maya's heart pounded as she realized they were now the last vehicle. "Liam, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know," he replied, his eyes darting nervously. "But we need to get out of here." The fog grew thicker, swirling like a living entity. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, with no sign of an exit. The trees loomed closer, their twisted branches almost scraping the sides of the car. And then they saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by the car's headlights. It was a man, but his features were indistinct, as if his face were shrouded in shadow. His clothes were tattered, and his head was tilted unnaturally to one side. Maya slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just feet away from the figure. "What do we do?" she whispered, her hands shaking. Before Liam could respond, the figure raised a hand and pointed behind them. Slowly, Maya turned her head, dread pooling in her stomach. In the rearview mirror, she saw the missing vehicles, silent, dark, and empty. They were lined up on the road, their headlights off, their interiors void of any passengers. And then, one by one, their lights flickered on. The convoy of empty vehicles began to move, their engines roaring to life. They advanced toward Maya's car, their headlights blinding in the fog. "Go!" Liam shouted, snapping Maya out of her trance. She floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as the car shot forward. The figure in the road didn't move. As they passed him, Maya felt an icy chill seep into the car, like a ghost brushing against her skin. The road ahead was endless, the fog impenetrable. No matter how far they drove, they couldn't escape the blinding headlights behind them. And then, the radio crackled to life. "Derek?" Maya said, her voice trembling, but the voice that came through wasn't Derek's. It was a whisper, cold and inhuman. "You can't leave." The car sputtered, the engine stalling. Maya and Liam sat in silence as the convoy of empty vehicles surrounded them, their headlights casting an unnatural glow. The last thing Maya saw was the figure from the road, standing in front of her car, his shadow stretching impossibly long. Then, everything went dark. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.